Imagine waking up one morning with a fever so intense, it feels like your blood is on fire. By nightfall, your neck and armpits swell with painful black lumps. Within days, you are dead. This was not a nightmare. This was daily life in the 1300s. Europe at that time was crowded, dirty, and unprepared. Streets were filled with waste, animals roamed freely, and people rarely bathed. Most believed illness was caused by bad air or God's punishment. No one knew about bacteria. No one understood how disease spread. Then, without warning, death arrived. The plague's journey began far from Europe, moving silently along trade routes from Asia. Merchant ships crossed seas carrying spices, silk, and something far deadlier. Rats lived aboard these ships, and on the rats were fleas infected with the plague. When ships docked in ports like Venice and Genoa, the disease stepped onto land. At first, people thought it was just another sickness. Then neighbors began dying. Entire households fell silent. Bodies piled up faster than graves could be dug. Church bells rang constantly until there were no bells left to ring. The symptoms were horrifying. Victims developed high fevers, vomiting, and blackened skin. The swollen lumps, called buboes, burst and oozed blood and pus. Most people died within 3 days. Some collapsed in the streets. Others died alone behind locked doors. Doctors were helpless. They wore long robes and masks shaped like bird beaks, filled with herbs to block the bad air. Treatments included bloodletting, burning incense, or placing live animals on the body to absorb the disease. None of it worked. Fear spread faster than the plague itself. Parents fled from sick children. Friends refused to touch each other. Towns were abandoned overnight. Some believed the world was ending. Others turned violent, blaming outsiders and the innocent. By the time the plague slowed, nearly 1/3 of Europe's population was dead. Farms were empty. Cities were quiet. The survivors looked around and realized the world they once knew was gone forever. Europe in the 1300s was a continent already on the edge of collapse long before the plague ever appeared. Life for most people was harsh, uncertain, and exhausting. The land had been strained by years of overfarming, and the climate had grown colder and wetter during a period known today as the Little Ice Age. Crops failed again and again. Fields flooded, harvests shrank, and food became scarce. Hunger was not occasional, it was constant. Families survived on thin bread, rotten grain, and whatever roots or scraps they could find. Malnutrition weakened bodies, especially children, leaving entire communities physically fragile. War made life even worse. Conflicts between kingdoms, lords, and rival claimants never truly stopped. Armies marched across farmland, trampling crops and stealing food from villages already on the brink of starvation. Young men were taken to fight, never to return, while those left behind struggled to survive. Towns were burned, trade routes were disrupted, and refugees crowded into cities seeking safety. These cities, already overcrowded, became pressure chambers of human suffering. Hygiene was almost non-existent by modern standards. Most people believed bathing was unhealthy, and water sources were often contaminated with waste. Streets were narrow and filthy, filled with animal dung, rotting food, and human waste thrown directly from windows. Rats thrived in this environment, nesting in homes, barns, and marketplaces. Fleas fed freely on both animals and humans, unnoticed and unchecked. Homes were dark, damp, and packed with entire families sleeping close together, sharing blankets, air, and disease. Medical knowledge offered no protection. People did not understand germs or infection. Illness was blamed on evil spirits, poisonous air, or divine punishment. Hospitals were rare and often more dangerous than staying at home. Treatments were based on superstition rather than science, and many made patients weaker instead of stronger. When sickness appeared, people had no way to stop it from spreading. Social structures were already strained. The poor were desperate, the wealthy were fearful, and trust in leadership was fragile. Faith was strong, but answers were few. Europe in the 1300s was not a healthy, stable world waiting to be attacked. It was a weakened body, starved, wounded, and exposed. When the plague arrived, it did not need to break down defenses. There were none left to break. The plague did not appear suddenly or magically in Europe. It moved slowly and deliberately across continents, hidden within the vast network of trade routes that connected Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. In the early 1300s, global trade was thriving. Caravans traveled thousands of miles across deserts and mountains, carrying silk, spices, precious metals, and other valuable goods. These routes, especially the Silk Road, were symbols of wealth and connection. But they also became highways for disease. In the grasslands of Central Asia, the plague bacterium lived quietly among wild rodents. Fleas feeding on these animals became infected, and when trade caravans passed through these regions, rats followed the food supplies. They crept into sacks of grain, bundles of cloth, and wooden crates stacked on camels and wagons. No one noticed them. No one suspected that death was traveling with them. As caravans moved west, they stopped at trading cities where merchants from many regions gathered. These crowded hubs were perfect environments for the plague to spread. Fleas jumped from rat to rat, then from rats to humans. Traders fell sick along the road, dying far from home, while others continued their journey, unknowingly carrying the infection forward. From land routes, the plague reached the sea. Merchant ships sailing from Black Sea ports became floating carriers of disease. Rats nested below deck, feeding on stored food, while infected fleas spread freely in the confined spaces of the ships. Sailors began to fall ill during long voyages, often dying before reaching their destination. Sometimes entire crews were dead by the time ships arrived at European ports. When these ships docked in Mediterranean cities, the plague finally stepped onto European soil. Ports like Messina, Genoa, and Venice were bustling centers of commerce, crowded with dockworkers, merchants, and sailors. Goods were unloaded quickly, and rats escaped onto land, blending into the already filthy streets. Within days, people began to fall sick. Within weeks, the disease was spreading inland along roads and rivers, following the same trade networks that once brought prosperity. The very system that connected the medieval world and fueled its economy became the plague's greatest weapon. Trade routes that carried wealth, culture, and ideas now carried death, linking distant lands in a shared catastrophe that no border could stop. Merchant ships were the perfect vessels for carrying the plague into Europe, even though no one aboard understood what was happening. These ships were built for long journeys and heavy cargo, not cleanliness. Their dark, damp holds were packed with grain, cloth, and barrels of food, exactly the conditions rats needed to survive and multiply. Wherever food went, rats followed, nesting deep within the ship where sailors rarely looked. On the bodies of these rats lived fleas, tiny and easily overlooked, yet deadly. When a flea bit an infected rat, it swallowed the plague bacterium. As rats began to die from the disease, the starving fleas searched desperately for new hosts. Humans became the next target. A single bite was enough to pass the infection. And sailors, already weakened by exhaustion and poor nutrition, fell sick quickly. Life aboard merchant ships made the spread inevitable. Crews lived in cramped quarters, sleeping close together and sharing water and supplies. Ventilation was poor, and filth collected below deck. When sailors developed fevers or strange swellings, there was nowhere to isolate them. Some died during the voyage and were thrown overboard. Others survived long enough to reach port, unknowingly carrying the disease with them. When these ships arrived in European harbors, they were greeted as symbols of wealth and opportunity. Dock workers rushed to unload cargo. Merchants crowded the docks, and rats scurried off the ships into warehouses, homes, and marketplaces. Fleas moved with them, blending seamlessly into cities already full of rodents. In some ports, entire crews were found dead or dying on arrival. Ships sat silently at anchor, their sails hanging loose, warning of something terribly wrong. But trade rarely stopped for long. Goods were too valuable, and curiosity overcame fear. Each ship that docked released another wave of infection, turning busy ports into the first epicenters of the plague. From these coastal cities, the disease spread rapidly inland. Roads and rivers carried traders, messengers, and refugees. Along with the invisible passengers, they could not escape. The rats and fleas from merchant ships had done their work. Europe's gates were open, and the plague had already stepped inside. The disease spread with a speed that shattered all logic and expectation. One day a town appeared normal, and the next it was drowning in death. People could not understand how a sickness could move so quickly, leaping from house to house and street to street, without warning. There were no visible rules, no clear patterns. Healthy people collapsed in the morning and were buried by nightfall. Entire families vanished in a matter of days. Travel made the spread unstoppable. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and messengers moved constantly between towns and cities. They carried letters, goods, and news, and unknowingly, the disease itself. By the time a town realized it was infected, travelers had already left, spreading the plague to the next village down the road. Rivers and highways became invisible chains, linking one outbreak to another. Crowded cities accelerated the disaster. Narrow streets forced people into close contact, and homes were packed with multiple generations living together. Markets, churches, and taverns brought hundreds into tight spaces every day. One cough, one flea bite, one moment of contact was enough. The plague did not need weeks to spread, it needed hours. Fear only made things worse. When people noticed sickness, many fled in panic, believing escape would save them. Instead, they carried the disease with them into the countryside. Villages that had been untouched for weeks suddenly erupted in illness after welcoming refugees seeking shelter. Doctors and officials were powerless. Without knowledge of bacteria or infection, they could not explain why the disease ignored wealth, age, or strength. Some believed it was carried by poisoned air, others by foreign enemies or divine punishment. While people argued and prayed, the plague continued its march. News of the disease traveled slower than the disease itself. By the time warnings reached distant regions, the plague had already arrived. Bells rang, graves filled, and still the sickness moved on, faster than thought, faster than fear. Leaving behind silence and the stunned disbelief of those who survived. The symptoms of the plague struck without mercy and without warning. A person could feel healthy in the morning, walking, working, laughing, and by evening be shaking with violent chills and burning fever. The change was so sudden that many believed the disease was a curse rather than an illness. Victims complained of crushing headaches, dizziness, and a pain so deep it felt as if their bones were breaking from the inside. Within hours, the most feared signs appeared. Dark, swollen lumps rose in the armpits, neck, and groin, large, hard, and unbearably painful. These swellings, later called buboes, turned black or purple as the flesh beneath began to die. Some burst open, releasing blood and foul, smelling pus. The sight alone was enough to terrify families into fleeing the room. As the disease worsened, victims began vomiting, sometimes blood. Their skin darkened from internal bleeding, giving rise to the name Black Death. Breathing became difficult as lungs filled with fluid, and coughing sprayed infection into the air. In some cases, death came so fast that people collapsed in the streets, never making it home. Most victims died within 2 or 3 days of the first symptoms. Some died within hours. There was rarely time to prepare, to pray, or to say goodbye. The speed of death crushed hope. Those who cared for the sick often fell ill themselves, creating a chain of suffering that consumed entire households. The unpredictability was perhaps the most terrifying part. Strong young adults died as quickly as the elderly. No one was safe. Survival seemed random, and that randomness destroyed confidence in medicine, faith, and even reason. Each new fever was a death sentence waiting to be confirmed. The symptoms did not just kill bodies, they shattered minds. People lived in constant fear of their own flesh betraying them. A headache, a fever, a swelling, each could mean death within days. And in the world of the 1300s, once the symptoms appeared, survival was the exception, not the rule. Doctors in the 1300s faced the plague with confidence on the outside and complete ignorance underneath. Medical knowledge was based on ancient theories, especially the idea that the body was controlled by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease, they believed, came from an imbalance of these humors or from poisoned air. Because the true cause of the plague was unknown, every treatment was a guess, and most guesses were dangerously wrong. Physicians prescribed bloodletting as one of their most common cures. They believed draining blood would restore balance. But instead it weakened patients, who were already fighting for their lives. Others recommended violent purging using laxatives or vomiting, inducing potions, pushing fragile bodies closer to collapse. Some advised patients to sit near fires or inhale smoke, believing it would cleanse the air inside the lungs. The most famous image of plague doctors came later: long coats and eerie masks, shaped like bird beaks. These beaks were stuffed with herbs, flowers, and spices meant to filter out the bad air. While the masks may have offered slight protection by accident, doctors had no idea why. To the sick, these figures looked less like healers and more like messengers of death. Superstition filled the gap where science failed. Patients were told to carry gemstones, drink crushed emeralds mixed with water, or place live animals, such as chickens or frogs, on swollen buboes to draw out the disease. Others were advised to rub vinegar on their skin or sleep surrounded by strong-smelling plants. None of it stopped the infection. Hospitals were overcrowded and unsafe. Instead of healing centers, they became places where disease spread faster. Doctors moved from patient to patient without washing their hands, carrying infection with them. Many physicians refused to treat the sick at all, fleeing cities to protect themselves, leaving the poor to suffer alone. As treatments failed again and again, trust in medicine collapsed. People turned instead to prayer, charms, or desperation. The plague exposed the limits of medieval knowledge, revealing that even the most educated minds of the time were powerless against the disease. Doctors had titles, robes, and rituals, but no cure. Fear became as destructive as the plague itself, tearing apart the bonds that held families and communities together. Once people realized how deadly and contagious the disease was, survival instinct overpowered love, duty, and tradition. The sick were no longer seen as relatives or neighbors, but as walking sources of death. A single cough or fever was enough to turn affection into terror. Families faced impossible choices. Parents abandoned sick children. Children fled from dying parents. Husbands left wives locked inside rooms, marked with signs of infection. Many believed that staying meant certain death, while leaving offered at least a chance to survive. Homes that once echoed with voices became silent prisons, where the sick waited alone. Towns began to unravel. Shops closed as merchants either died or fled. Fields went unharvested. Markets disappeared. Priests, doctors, and officials often escaped first, leaving no leadership behind. Laws lost meaning when there was no one left to enforce them. Bodies remained in houses or streets for days, spreading both disease and despair. Social order collapsed rapidly. With death everywhere, fear erased morality. Some people looted empty homes. Others refused to help the dying or bury the dead. Gravediggers demanded high pay or abandoned their work entirely. In many places, mass graves were dug because there were too many bodies for individual burials. Entire towns were deserted. Villages emptied overnight as survivors fled into forests or distant regions. Roads were filled with wandering refugees, carrying their fear and infection with them. Bells stopped ringing, schools closed, and festivals vanished. Life itself seemed to retreat. Trust disappeared. Neighbors suspected one another. Strangers were turned away or attacked. Hospitality, once sacred, became dangerous. Fear ruled every decision, and compassion became a risk few were willing to take. By the time the plague passed through, many towns were shells of their former selves, houses standing, streets empty, and communities destroyed not only by death, but by the fear that forced people to turn away from one another. The sheer scale of death was beyond anything Europe had ever experienced. Entire generations were wiped out in a matter of years. In some regions, half the population vanished. Streets that once overflowed with life became quiet and empty, and the absence of people was felt everywhere. There were not enough hands to work the fields, run businesses, or maintain cities. Daily life had to change because the old way of living was no longer possible. For survivors, ordinary routines disappeared. Farms lay abandoned, crops rotted in the fields, and food production collapsed. With so many workers dead, labor suddenly became valuable. Peasants, who had once been powerless now, demanded higher wages and better conditions. Some left their villages entirely, searching for opportunity in a world reshaped by loss. The rigid social order of medieval Europe began to crack under the weight of necessity. Religion was shaken deeply. Many people had believed that faith alone would protect them, yet even the most devoted priests and monks died in great numbers. Churches filled with the sick, then emptied as clergy perished or fled. Some lost faith entirely, questioning why God had allowed such suffering. Others became more extreme, believing the plague was a punishment for sin. Groups of flagellants marched from town to town, whipping themselves in public to beg for forgiveness, spreading fear and disease as they went. The authority of the church weakened. Its inability to stop the plague or explain it caused doubt to grow. At the same time, new forms of belief and personal faith emerged, as people searched for meaning in a broken world. Death became a constant presence in art, literature, and thought. Paintings and stories focused on skeletons, decay, and the fragility of life, reflecting a society obsessed with mortality. Social relationships also changed. With death so common, life felt uncertain and short. Some people lived more cautiously, while others abandoned restraint entirely, believing tomorrow was never guaranteed. Laws, customs, and traditions adapted to a world where survival had become the central concern. By killing millions, the plague did more than reduce the population. It transformed how people worked, worshipped, and understood their place in society. The medieval world that emerged afterward was not the same one that had existed before the plague arrived. Those who survived the plague woke each day to a world that felt unfamiliar and broken. Loss was everywhere. Empty houses lined streets where families once lived. Tools lay untouched, fields overgrown, and workshops silent. Survivors were surrounded by reminders of those who had vanished: parents, children, friends, neighbors, gone without warning or farewell. Grief was not private, it was shared by entire communities. Daily life carried a heavy emotional weight. Many survivors struggled with guilt, asking why they had lived while others had died. Some feared the plague would return at any moment, living in constant anxiety over every ache or fever. Trust was slow to rebuild, as memories of abandonment and fear still lingered. People were cautious around one another, aware of how quickly safety had once disappeared. The population lost reshaped relationships and opportunities. With so many dead, survivors inherited land, homes, and positions they would never have held before. Social boundaries weakened. A peasant might now own land, and a laborer could demand fair wages. Yet these changes came at a cost. The old sense of stability was gone, replaced by uncertainty and adaptation. Cultural attitudes shifted as well. Death was no longer distant or abstract, it was familiar. Survivors spoke openly about mortality, and art and literature reflected a darker, more realistic view of life. Joy, when found, was intense but fragile. Celebrations were quieter, faith more personal, and hope cautious. Communities slowly rebuilt, but they were forever changed. Traditions continued, yet they carried the memory of absence. The plague left behind more than graves. It left a generation shaped by trauma, resilience, and awareness of how quickly everything could be taken away. Survivors did not return to the world they once knew. They learned to live in a new one, forged by loss, where life was valued more deeply because death had proven how close it always was. In the end, the bubonic plague was not just a disease. It was a turning point in human history. It stripped away certainty, exposed the fragility of life, and forced people to confront death on a scale never seen before. From the silence of abandoned towns to the quiet strength of those who rebuilt, the plague reshaped how society lived, worked, and believed. Out of unimaginable loss came a changed world, one that would never again see life, faith, or humanity in quite the same way.